this is the Provoked Prawn, and in this video I'm going to show you how to build the Corsair 2000D Airflow, and I'm doing it with Corsair's iCue Link system. But to start it off, I want to show you what it looks like against the 5000D Airflow, because as you can see it's a small stature ITX case, but one that's still pretty roomy, with enough space for a 4070 Ti and a 360mm radiator for all-in-one cooler, as well as multiple fans. So I want to talk to you about the highlights of the case, how to build in it, the logic for doing so, and show you every step of what I did, as well as some of the things to think about when you're building in it, or if you get to that stage, what to consider. I'm going to do a separate review on the case and talk about what it's been like to use and some other things, so subscribe if you haven't already to find out more about it. But here I want to show you the features of it to start with, and then I'm going to go into the build process and show you all the different things that I did and why, and the hiccups I found along the way, the small little things. You'll see from multiple angles, loads of dust shielding on this case, including a removable panel at the rear, and the side panels which come off with ease. Basically the whole thing comes apart in relatively simple ways with thumb screws and clips. A quick note, you can actually put those side panels on the wrong way around, so watch out for that at the end, because I want to talk about how you can do that without realizing. Small little hints like that I want to talk about and show off, and be careful with that front panel because that just flies off if you're clumsy like me, so that's something to keep in mind. But you can see immediately there's a fan tray for up to a 360mm radiator or multiple different fans, so there's plenty of options. I'll leave the specs in the description of what you can do with it and what's included in there. It has some really interesting setup logic to it though. For example, the power supply unit mounts on the top that you can see here, and then a cable runs around the back. More on that in a minute. And then you've got this awkward underside tray where the I/O plugs in, so your HDMI DisplayPort USB cables, and we'll get to that at the end as well. So that's a little bit tricky and one of the downsides of the case, but something we'll get to later on. This obviously requires a small form factor power supply unit as well, so I'm going to show you that in a little while. And there's some interesting highlights. So this is the Airflow version of the case, which comes with 3 pre-installed fans, and these are the AF120 fans. However, these are different versions of those fans, and I'll show that in a minute as well, because these are a thinner, a slimmer design than your traditional AF120s. Something to keep in mind. It also has a front panel power and reset button, 2 USB-A connections and a USB-C connection as well, and I'll show you a connection for that later on. So you get 3 fans as standard, which is nice, but you also have fan controllers inside as well. More on that in a second. So you actually get quite a lot of things for your money, which is nice and gives you the benefit of being able to install various different things. I'm not going to use the fans in this build. And the only reason for that is I wanted to show what you could do with it and the considerations of it. But the fact that you've got them installed and you have like these protective trays on the rear of them is pretty nice, and you have the fan controllers to do it. So you could get away with using a CPU cooler or a 360mm radiator and just keeping the fans that are pre-installed, and maybe adding in some more of the same of the AF120 fans and connecting them up. So it gives you options. So you've got a lot going on there out of the box immediately. You're going to see I've stripped most of it down now as well. So I've taken off all the side panels, front and top, so you can see inside. And one of the things that's immediately obvious is the SSD tray, which you'll see under there. So on this one side is the fan tray / radiator mounting bracket, and that's just held in place with 2 screws and then a clip at the bottom, a couple of clips that sort of work their way into the case. And once you get that off, you can then see all the different cables. Now, on the left-hand side here, which is obviously at the top, you have the RGB hub and a PWM fan controller with connections for up to 6 fans. So more on that in a bit. And obviously the 3 fans that are pre-installed are already wired into it. There's also an SSD tray in there. And then, as I showed earlier, you've got a little extra box of goodies included in there, which is essentially just the screws and cable ties and other bits that you'll need for your build and that you can use to set it up. I'm going to quickly show you the labeling for those and what to do. I'm going to show you the process for installing SSDs in here as well. You've got potential for mounting 3 SSDs in here, but there's only 1 cage included, which is weird. Bags of screws in 3 different ways. You can just pause that and see what they are, but the small ones are the SSD screws. Then you've got motherboard screws and hard disk drive screws, and then you've got fan screws included. So if you add in extra fans, you have those screws. So some of these might not be necessary. And for this build, I am going to show you how to install SSD, a 2.5 inch, but I'm not actually going to use it. And the process for installing a hard disk drive is basically, I don't know. I don't think there is actually mounting points for that. But you can see that we have this tray included. And what you need to do is basically align it. Pretty standard. If you've seen the Corsair 4000D, 5000D or 7000D, they have the same mounting tray process here. Basically just screw in 4 screws into this tray and then the tray can be put in the case. It's weird because it has the option to do 2 of these, but there's only 1 tray included, so you don't get that as an extra. But there is another mounting point that I'll show you in a second. So you can attach this to the tray and then that then goes over the PSU shroud. So the area where the power supply unit's going to mount, it's basically on the back of that. It clips into one place and then screws down with a thumb screw, and that's one of the mounting positions for your SSD if you want it. The other thing of interest is though that you can move it, so you can actually put it further up if you want to. So it will go on the top part of the tray as well. So you can see if you had 2 of these trays, you could actually put 2 SSDs in here, but weirdly they've only included 1. I don't really know why, but you could probably buy that as an extra. You can actually mount another one just above that potentially by mounting it directly to the case. You can see there's 4 holes there. Now, as I said, you've got PWM and RGB controllers in here. Those are pre-installed. I'm actually going to remove them. 1, so I can show you the wiring logic, and 2, because I'm not going to be using them, so it'll free up some space. But it's nice to have these included. So obviously these give you the fan power and RGB control. You can connect them up to your motherboard via USB connection and a sys fan header, and then SATA power, and then you'll be able to control the fan speed and the RGB lighting of these all from a couple of controllers. Now, I've done a wiring guide on Corsair's AF120 RGB Elite fans separately, and just generally for Corsair's fans, I'll link to in the description, where I've gone into a lot of depth on how to set it up. But this sort of logic, including this with the 2000D, is fantastic because it means obviously you can add in extra fans. The standard ones are already pre-wired and ready to go. All you need to do is make the connections to your motherboard and power supply unit. But having that as an extra bonus, because it means you don't have to buy an additional controller or worry about finding multiple system fan headers on your motherboard. So that's great. But for the purpose of this video, I'm actually going to be removing these fans because I want to swap them out with Corsair's iCue Link system. The idea being that iCue, if you don't know, essentially allows you to connect up multiple fans in a more daisy chain connection, where there's far less cables. So you can see if you get these fans out, we've got 2 cables per fan, which means 6 cables just from these fans. That's a lot of cables to deal with. And obviously, yes, you've got the controllers, but there's still a lot of cables inside the case, and it's already a small case you're going to be putting a lot of things into, so shedding them is actually beneficial. But this is the connection for it, so you can see this is the PWM fan controller. You basically you have the 3 fan connections in there, and then you'd connect that to your motherboard and power supply, and then the RGB side of the fans plugs into the RGB controller. So easy-ish. Obviously, I'm just showing you the wiring logic outside the case so you can see it more easily, and you'll see that the RGB cable is marked to RGB hub as well. So it is fairly straightforward, but you don't actually need to plug these bits in because they're already connected. So if you are planning on using those pre-installed fans, then it's not a problem. Although I'm not going to use them in this build. In case you are, I'm going to cover the wiring logic for the fans. So here you can see them with the Commander Core XT, but in this instance, obviously we're using PWM and RGB controller. So the RGB controller, the RGB connects like so, as I've shown you. And then this controller has a USB connection on it and a SATA power connection. This is very similar to the RGB hub that you'll get with Corsair's RGB fans. You usually just plug the RGB connector into there, and then USB and SATA power. The USB connects up to your motherboard. Usually that's in the bottom middle where the USB port is on there, as you can see here, although it's slightly different on ITX motherboards and on this one that I'm going to use in this build, and I'll show you that in a minute. But you plug that in, that then allows you to control the RGB from iCue. We then use the SATA power connector, which is this flat connector used for SSDs and hard disk drives, and that can be used for all sorts of things. Commander Core XT, the RGB controller, fan power controller, variety of other things. So that is really a simple connection. You'll see it has multiple connectors on it as well. So if you are using this cable in your case, you can connect up multiple devices to it. And then that plugs up on the SATA/PATA end of the power supply unit. So on the connector there, you just plug that bit in there, and then obviously you can connect up multiple different things with these. So that's the RGB controller. And then obviously you need to do the fan power as well. So the fan power is a PWM repeater, which basically means that you need to use your system fan header on your motherboard. So here you can see this is the connection for that. Obviously it does 6 fan cables powering those potentially, but it doesn't need SATA power. So again, you need that SATA power connection, but you need a PWM header on your motherboard, which is a sys fan or chassis fan header. So it's the smaller cable here. We're looking for a connection on the motherboard where you can plug that in. You can see some example here with CHA fans, or you might find sys fan. And I'll show you the connector on the motherboard I'm using. And then you need SATA power as well. So enough to power the fans, and then the motherboard has control over the fan speed. So that's the setup there. Interesting highlight though, and a thing to bear in mind, is that the standard fans included with the case, as you can see on the right here, are slimmer. So the one on the left is the standard AF120 RGB Elite fan, which as you can see is thicker and has a slightly different design to the back for airflow purposes. The one that's included with the case is thinner, and it also comes with that cage on the rear of it as well, which is removable. Now for this build, here are some of the things I'm going to be using. As I said, the Corsair iCue Link system, which includes this 360mm radiator and extra fans, the B650i from Gigabyte, tiny little motherboard, tiny squashy banana for size comparison, a 4070 Ti, and some other bits too, which we'll get to in a little while, but I want to show you the process for this. Now, one point of interest I want to mention immediately, and I'll show you later on, is obviously these iCue Link, they're the QX fans, they're standard fan size, so they are a little bit fatter. You will notice that I have mounted the standard bracket that came off the back of the AF120 fans to these fans. Now it's for protective purposes to stop cables and things catching on the fans when they're installed, because it's going to be very close to the motherboard, and that's going to be one of the downsides and something that's important to keep in mind before you go through this process. So I'd recommend watching the whole video, because you will see the problem that I came across where the fans are actually in a position where they ever so slightly block the motherboard installation, and that could be problematic. I did manage to get it in there, as you'll see, but it's very tight. So if you are going to be using standard fans, whether it's these or let's say QL120s, LL120s, or whatever other fans you're using from Corsair or any other company, you might find that they're a bit too deep and could cause you issues. The other thing to bear in mind is how to run the cables, which is another issue that I'll show you. So for this, you only have one cable for these 3 fans, much better than the 6 that come with the standard ones. And then you have the controller for the iCue Link system, which plugs in with that single cable into there, and then it connects up. As I said, I've done a guide on the system and the wiring of it and the logic of it. It is very expensive, so you might not want to do it, but I wanted to show just how good it would be for a build like this where it's a lot smaller. Then you've got a 360mm radiator which will fit in here. That will need to be mounted to the cage. And the interesting point here is actually they recommend putting the fans on the opposite side, so towards the rear of the case, which is fine. But I also need to think about the logic of how I'm going to install the radiator, which way round it's going to go. And this actually has an impact as well later on, where you've got to think about the tubes a lot more than you would on a bigger case. So something to consider. But here you can see I'm taking the fans off. So these fans are actually pre-installed on this radiator with the iCue Link system, and you have to remove them, which is fine, and then mount them on the other side, but also the other way around, so they're pulling air through the radiator and exhausting out of the case. So what I'm doing with this setup is essentially I've got those 3 fans that you saw initially as intake fans on the front of the case, and then these 3 as exhaust through the radiator, and that's on the side. So you'll have that set up there, and that's basically the options for what you can do with fan mounting. You can add additional fans if you have a slim GPU. So you can actually put them on the GPU side. The 4070 Ti isn't slim enough to allow that, but if you have a small or thinner GPU, you can potentially do it, so that's interesting. Now, this iCue Link system is beneficial because there's no cables coming out of the pump head. Essentially, everything is controlled by the radiator and then off to that controller that you saw earlier on. So it means there's very few cables, which is perfect for an ITX build like this, because there's a lot less to deal with, and there's not much room here, as you can imagine. So you can see now I'm trying to work out the logic of where to install the radiators so the pump will be in a good position. It's thinking about where the tubes are going to be, what they're going to be blocking, and what they're going to be interfering with. They're quite thick and obviously quite long, ideal for other cases, not so much for this one. Could do with shorter ones. I actually found that they do end up getting in the way. But what I have done, what I decided would be the best thing to do, is to put tubes down towards the bottom of the case, and then in theory that'll be fine for any air bubbles that build up over time, but also hopefully not interfere with anything else during that process. So just think about the planning and the logic of what you're doing during this installation process. Think about it before you fit everything else in there, just so you can work out what's what and where it's going to go and make sure everything fits nicely. And then, we're going to be working out where the CPU block's going to go in terms of where it'll be positioning over the motherboard, because that will be obviously right next to that PSU cage as well. So there's a lot to cram into this small frame. I have actually found that it still runs hot as well. So something to keep in mind. But as I said, I'm going to cover those sorts of things in the review. This is all about the build process and the considerations for it. So now I'm mounting the fans back onto the radiator. I'm using the long radiator screws to go through the fan tray, through the fans and into the radiator. These fans are set to pull air, so you've got the back of them facing the outside of the case, and you're pulling air through the radiator and then exhausting out the rear. The reason for this is obviously once it's set up like this, you won't have much space on the other side. The fans will be very close to components and wiring, so it wouldn't be ideal to have them on the other side where you'd normally have them and positioned in a way that would be pulling air through the radiator and then pushing out the back. This is the better position for it just because of how much room you won't have once this tray is mounted down over the top of all the other components. So something to keep in mind. And that's the process for doing that. And then I'm just once again checking and making sure that's all going to fit nicely. And you can see once that's shut down, it looks pretty neat from this angle. And also it does allow for the RGB lighting as well, because with these fans, you've got the RGB ring and the fan blades. So it shows through on the other side really well. So for this build, I'm using the B650i RGB Ultra motherboard from Gigabyte, and this is a tiny little board. It was actually really interesting in terms of the setup of it, because it will take 3 NVMe SSDs on it, one of which is a PCIe Gen 5 drive as well. So really interesting highlights to it. Decent amount of IO on there as well. But the other highlight is, as I'll show you in a second, that the drive bay actually has a little fan on it as well for cooling a Gen 5 drive, which is pretty essential, as I have shown in previous videos with the Seagate Fire Cooler, which is going to be featured in here, and the Crucial T700, which is another Gen 5 drive. They run really hot, so cooling is important. Now, this motherboard's also interesting because things like your SATA connection, so this is the cable for connecting up SSDs and hard disk drives, is actually in an expansion card, so it's not as standard installed on the motherboard. More on that a little bit later on. Also, front panel connections are included in this adapter cable, which allows you to connect up multiple front panel connections. For the USB connections, you even have a cable, so the USB doesn't connect directly to the motherboard, it's via this extension cable. All of these things means that you can manage the cables a bit better. System fan headers, same sort of logic, another cable that plugs into the motherboard. So lots of things going on here, and RGB cables. Now, I'm not going to be using a lot of these. For example, I'm not going to use the data cables for the SSDs and hard disk drives, which are these, as I said, because I'm not going to be setting it up with that, which means I also won't be using that expansion card that I showed you, but I am going to show you the logic for it. I'm also going to do a detailed feature guide and roundup of the things to think about with this board, so subscribe if you haven't already to check that out. But you get a little Wi-Fi antenna as well included, because it does have Wi-Fi 6 capabilities. This presents a bit of an issue because you have to run this out the bottom of this case, and that's one of the downsides to the 2000D, is just the setup of how the wiring works, especially for someone like me that's regularly have to unplug things. But here you can see that's the setup of this board and the different things that are included. And I want to show you some of the installation logic and things to think about as we go through here. I'm also going to show you the wiring for powering it and for connecting things up. So the expansion card I want to talk about, although I'm not going to use it, I want to show you some of the things about it of interest. So it has the connections for SATA. So if you're using SSDs, if you do use a single SSD or multiple SSDs because you bought extra, you can plug them in here. There's also a connection for a sysfan header, for a 12 volt RGB header, and for the front panel connections. These are the adapters, and I'm going to show you the process for that. Now, this card just slots into this like that, and clicks in there, and you can only put it in one way, and then obviously you then plug in the extra things there. So if you use an SSD, you'd use those SSD cables I showed you earlier, and if you're using the front panel connections, we'll do that in a second, and then sysfan headers. There's a lack of system fan headers on this motherboard. Not an issue for the build that I'm doing with the iCue Link or indeed if you're using the standard fans of the 2000D. I think it's still worth talking about these things though, because if you are using a similar board, then you might have maybe added in some extra fans, so that might be worth thinking about. This front panel adapter allows you to plug in multiple different things as well. So it has the connections for the speaker, for the HDD LEDs, power LEDs, reset switch, power switch, and other things. So you've got all the standard connections, but it's just an expansion cable rather than directly on the motherboard, which is a curious design. But if you have a standard front panel connector like this, which admittedly we don't in the 2000D, but I do want to show it because it's pretty interesting, then that would plug in just one side of it, making sure to line up with the relevant parts. So you can see on the right hand side, it's for the speaker and other bits. On the bottom side, on the left hand side here, it's for your standard front panel connections. So obviously with the 2000D, we have individual cables, as I showed you a minute ago, and more on that in a second because you have a choice of where to install them, and that's an important point. So these are those standard cables with the 2000D. You've got a power switch, a reset switch, and power LEDs. This is obviously for the front, for the main power button, for the reset switch, which is the tiny button on the right-hand side, and also the power LED, which just lights it up and lets you know when the power is running. Now, directly on this motherboard, you have a power button and a reset button connector just below the USB 3.2. You can see there a bit further down. So I'm just going to show you the connections for those. So if you're doing what I'm doing here, you don't need to use that expansion card that I showed you. You also don't need to worry about the power LED potentially. If you're not going to use the power LED cables, you don't need to worry about using the expansion card, but you can't connect them up to the motherboard directly. I think that's nicer because it frees up some space. Again, minimizing the amount of cables that are in the case, something to think about, and makes life a little bit easier. It's an interesting setup with this motherboard, and obviously some considerations for it. I've done a wiring guide, by the way, on all the different cables and where you'd plug them in on the motherboard. So if you're not too clear on these things, then be sure to check that out, and I'll link to these videos in the description to help you out, but just give you a guide if you're not using this motherboard, using a different one, and you just need to know where things go. But for the system fan headers, so if you add in an extra fan or several extra fans, that's how they would connect up. You might use splitters, but on this case, it just plugs into that adapter. Now, the USB adapter obviously is a Y splitter, takes a single connection and breaks it into two. So you can see you've got two on one end. This isn't the standard setup though, because basically the connection just below the NVMe port and above your graphics card port is fairly unusual. That's not a standard connection there. So you wouldn't be able to plug a USB directly into that. You have to plug this in, and then you have that USB splitter ready to go with other things. So you'd connect up various different things to this potentially. An example would be a Commander Core from Corsair. So it needs USB so you can control your fans via iCue. And similarly, we'll use it with the controller from the iCue Link system. You might alternatively use it for other things as well. So other sorts of fan controllers. Something to bear in mind. So the process for installing NVMe SSDs. I'm going to show you the different spots on here, the things of interest about this board, and then things to consider. I've done a guide separately on the FireCuda 540, which I'll link to in the description. But the important parts to remember about here are to make sure you take those stickers off and ensure that the thermal pads are there and ready to go, because they'll help with cooling. But the interesting point that you can see here with this is that it has a fan built in directly into the heatsink. Ideal for this system in multiple ways. Obviously, airflow on an ITX case isn't going to be as good as a larger case. And also we're running a Gen 5 NVMe SSD, so we need to make sure that's cool. So the fact it's got thermal pads and a cooling fan should help ensure that it runs nice and cool. The other interesting thing here is if you remove this screw, you can actually pull this entire thing out, and on the other side is another port. So you actually have an extra port, and that is for a Gen 4 NVMe SSD. So you can have Gen 5 on one side, Gen 4 on the other, and obviously backwards compatible. So you could plug in Gen 4s on both sides, or even Gen 3, although that would be crazy, but you can do it. You see that you have stickers in all the different places and the thermal pads as well. So make sure you make the most of those. Make sure you take those stickers off. But I want to show you the setup. So I'm going to use a Crucial P5 Plus as the drive on the rear, and then the FireCuda drive as the main drive. I'm going to use that as the operating system drive, and other things, and then games and things will end up on the P5 Plus. A demonstration of how to do that. So there are pre-installed M2 screws in here. You can just pop those out and then put the drive into place. There's also extra standoff and extra M2 screws included in the box of this motherboard, so fairly helpful. What you need to do then is just secure the drive back down and re-screw it in. You'll notice that there's connectors on both ends of this adapter. They plug directly into the motherboard, and then obviously that allows the data to travel through to the system. So that's one drive mounted, then flip it over and then you can mount the other one. And the Gen 5 one goes on this side. You'll notice obviously that the fan is still connected, and we have various different other things on this little port. So it's actually an interesting little board here got going on. Make sure you take those stickers off though. Slot the 540 drive into there, and then there's a latch on this one. So instead of the M2 screw, little plastic latch that puts it into place. And then we just need to put the system back together. Obviously making sure that the fan heatsink is reinstalled once it's pushed back in. But just to quickly demonstrate that, again, as I said, there's a couple of clips on here where you basically just seat the drive back on to the motherboard and it clips into place there. It's fairly easy to do, but it's neat that you have this. And there's also an additional port on the other side of the motherboard that I'll show you in a second. So as I said, you can install 3 NVMe SSDs on this tiny little board, which is really neat. And also the number of lanes doesn't seem to degrade either. So I've got 2 drives on here and they both run at the right speeds and have the amount of PCIe lanes that they should do, which is pretty neat for a board this size as well. So we then reposition the screws, line up the system back in there and then screw it back in, obviously taking care to make sure that the cabling from the fan is still seated in place, and just screw those long screws back in. So we've got nice chunky cooling capabilities in here. I've actually found, by the way, that the cooling runs sufficiently for this Gen 5 drive. I'm going to do a more in-depth video on that though in the near future. So in the rear, there's a back plate, and this can be removed and then taken off fully. You can just about see the NVMe port on the back there. So you can take all of these off and then access an additional port. Now, this is hidden behind the standard tray, and you'll see that there's a little sticker there and there's another thermal pad underneath that. The installation is, again, there's already a screw pre-installed for the M2 drive, so you can just take that screw out, slot your drive in and then screw it back down. Now this is WD Black SN850, which I've taken the stickers off of because I wanted to do a test on that to see if the thermal performance improved or not removing stickers. People keep saying you should remove stickers, so I did some tests on that. I'll link to those videos in the description. The conclusion is, by the way, that you shouldn't, but I haven't got the stickers to put it back on, but it still runs okay. Now the thermal pads obviously came away with the stickers here because of my clumsiness, so just replace that onto there to make sure it's got good thermal cooling. Those thermal pads and heat sinks are important to make quite a bit of difference to the performance of your drives. So it's really important you use these, especially with the newer, faster drives, because if they run too hot, they will thermal throttle and then they won't run as well as they should, and which can reduce the speed and obviously reduce the longevity of the drive as well. So just putting those screws back in, taking note of the size of them because some of them were chunkier than the others, so to make sure we put them back in the right order and that it's secured nicely. So that's the setup of the NVMe SSDs, and now I'm going to prepare the motherboard. It's worth doing all these things outside the case, obviously, because the case is so tiny. We want to make sure it's well prepared beforehand, and we can do all of this outside. So now I'm installing the standoff screws in the motherboard. So the standard bracketing needs to come off for this iCue Link system, and then we install the standoffs that come with that. They have a fat thread on one side and a thinner one on the other, and you put them into the 4 corners. Then we install the AMD CPU. This is a Ryzen 7 7700X, and basically you have to very gently put that into the motherboard, ensuring not to damage any of the pins as you install it, and then lower the catch over the top and lower that back down until the plastic cap pops off, and now that is ready to go. And then obviously the next stage is to install the RAM. This is DDR5 Vengeance RAM with some nice RGB lighting, which you won't be able to see once the case is put together, but it is what it had knocking around, so it's what's going in, and it's fine for this build as well. It's worked fine too. So both drives are filled up, and then I'm just going to quickly show you how to plug in your other connections. So this is the USB 3.2, which is USB-A connections on the front of the motherboard, and then USB-C, which plugs in the bottom right-hand side, and that is easy to connect, but obviously you wouldn't do that right now. I just want to show you where they'd plug in because it'd be harder to see once everything else is set up into the case. Now I want to show some of the hiccups that I had with the 2000D and something to consider. So I mentioned earlier on the thickness of the fans can make a difference here. So what I found is when I went to seat the motherboard into the case, that it won't quite go in because the top of the I/O shield is pressing up against the protective tray around the fan. Obviously that's there on purpose to stop any cable interference with the fan, because obviously there's going to be cables near the top, which could be problematic. And I realized that I could probably force it up, but I might bend the shield. But I also noticed that perhaps if I remove the screw that's holding the bottom of that tray in, that would probably just give me a little bit more leeway. So this is a downside to using different fans versus the thinner ones. As I said, one thing to bear in mind, maybe I'm going to bend my motherboard a little bit. Not ideal. Perhaps I should have stuck with the original fans, but this is the fun of building in a case and using different things to what's already installed and something to consider. So you can see that it is possible. I have done it. Just force it up a little bit and then screw the standoffs in. So for reference, I showed them earlier on, but they have a sort of flat top and then a bobble on top of that, and you just screw, there's only 4 screws to go in this tiny little motherboard. So just push that in and then secure those down, and then you've got to run the cables. Now is when I noticed a problem, so hopefully you're not following along and doing exactly the same, because I want to show you something that I realized is that obviously we've got to run things like those front panel connections that I showed you a minute ago, USB-A, USB-C and the other bits, onto the right hand side of the motherboard. I can't just run them down the bottom of the case because that's where the graphics card's going to be. But what I did notice is that I could run them underneath the fan, so they will run up the top and sit across the top of the motherboard. It is possible to do that, so you can run them across the top and then down. But because the fans are thicker than the standard ones, I actually found that although I could fit the USB-C through here fairly easily, the rest of the cables weren't going to go in there. Now, one of the things that you will note is there are multiple cable tying points in this case, some of which I haven't used, and I don't use them on purpose because I want to show you the problems that we come across, but also I'm probably going to be taking this apart at some point and trying to get those undone without damaging things is a nightmare. But anyway, if you do this, you might want to cable tie things down because it might be a bit easier. The setup is going to be running those cables basically underneath the fans, but as I said, you can see the USB-A just wouldn't fit. Try as I might to get it under that gap, it was just too small and I couldn't negotiate my way around it just because of the chunkiness of that cable and the thickness of the fan. So a small problem. So once again, I've got to take the motherboard out. So this is the 3rd time I've taken a motherboard out, or 2nd. So it's worth planning these things out, or at least learning from my mistakes, and then you won't have the same problem. So if we cable tie with some of the included cable ties that came in the cardboard box from earlier on, I just tidied them up a little bit. You could use the various hooks and loops. You can see there are some at the top underneath these fans. We can tuck them under the fans, so despite them being thicker, you can actually get them there above the motherboard standoffs. Obviously it's important to make sure we have good clearance there, and also that these cables don't interfere with the fans. This shows you the importance of those rear cages where the fans are as well though, because if the cables are a little bit looser, obviously they'd be catching on the fan blades or blocking the airflow. That wouldn't be ideal. Well, you can see now those cables are running in there nicely, and once again, as I said, if you cable tie them down to the case, you probably have even more space and it would be better controlled. The other thing I've done is I've plugged in the 8-pin power cable for the CPU connector on the top left of the motherboard. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but I realized it would be easier to plug that in now than it would be to negotiate that in afterwards. I'd also recommend connecting up the CPU fan as well, so the CPU fan header from the pump is going to be connected up too, because that is again going to be fiddly, as I found out the hard way in a minute, and that's in the top left where that 8-pin CPU power connector is. So now I'm putting the motherboard back in again. I realise this has been a bit of a chore in terms of installing it, but I wanted to emphasize this. Just do the wiring first, think about the logic of where things are going to go, then install your motherboard and you'll save yourself the hassles of what I had. So now we have the power and reset switch connectors. Obviously, as I showed you already, those are going to plug in directly to the motherboard on the right hand side, just below the USB-A connector, which we're also going to plug in now. I'm plugging these things in now because I've realized that once you've got the power supply cables run through, you're not going to have much space because those PSU cables are going to come in right next to the motherboard, and there's not going to be much room to fiddle around trying to plug things in afterwards. So I thought it was worth doing this now, and you'll probably find the same as well. So connect up the USB-A, USB-C, and front panel power connections and sort that all out. Now, we have the fan controller for the iCue Link system, as I showed you. It's got one connector from the 3 fans at the front, but you also need to make sure you run the small cable from that to the CPU fan header, which is that grey little part right there next to the 8-pin CPU power connector on the left-hand side, top left of the motherboard there. It's a very small cable, but that obviously allows the system to understand what's going on with the CPU cooling and make sure the motherboard doesn't complain about that. So we need to run that cable through as well. Bit of a fiddle and definitely difficult to get in once everything's installed, so maybe consider doing that beforehand. So now we need a small form factor power supply unit. So this is the SF1000L, which is a 1000 watt power supply unit from Corsair. A magnificent little thing that can supply enough power for 40 series GPU and other powerful components in a compact case. So I'm going to show you the wiring for the things that I'm using. I'm going to do a video separately on this PSU with other things that you could connect up to it. But for the purposes of this build, I was going to quickly show you what I'm connecting up, so you could do the same if you're planning on doing it. So you have the 24-pin power supply cable. This is an ATX Gen 3 power supply unit, which uses Type 5 connectors. So they're smaller on the PSU end than they are on the motherboard end. And you can see the connectors are clearly marked. So for the 24-pin power supply for the motherboard, you've got it split into 2 parts, a smaller one and then a slightly larger one. That plugs in on this end. And we're showing you this all outside the case so you can see really clearly where things connect up. But obviously, I've already installed the motherboard. We're going back in time here a little bit. But you plug in that 24-pin power cable, make sure that little plastic clip is the right way around, which is usually on the right-hand side. And that then clicks over a notch on the 24-pin. It's really important to ensure this is properly installed because that will make sure that the system powers on properly. Then you have the 8-pin CPU power connector. Now, there's only one of these on this motherboard, but sometimes you might find 2, and there are 2 cables included with this PSU. So if you do have 2 cables, the logic would be the same. You plug the smaller end into the PSU where it says CPU or PCIe power, and then you plug the other end in to the motherboard in the top left. And again, don't do this outside the case. I'm just demoing it so you can clearly see where everything is. Nice flat cables, also quite short, which is ideal for this build, obviously, because it's a small form factor. If you had long cables, it'd be a pain for the build process. And then Gigabyte's 4070 Ti, and this power supply unit also comes with that cable which has that new NVIDIA adapter on it. So this is that 600 watt cable, and you plug 2 connectors into the power supply unit, and then the other end goes into your GPU. Now I'm showing the 4070 Ti. Obviously you could fit other older graphics cards in here, and this has the cables necessary for your standard 8-pin PCIe power connectors as well. So if you are using 30 series or 20 series or AMD or Intel, then you can do that. So don't worry, you do get all the necessary cables for whatever GPU you're using. But I'm using the 4070 and I want to show how to connect that up. So it just plugs in. You need to make sure this is properly seated. Now, one thing to bear in mind is this cable is a little bit longer, and as you'll see, this is actually a bit problematic. You have to be very careful with the 40 series, especially the high end of the 40 series, that the cable's plugged in well and isn't bent at an angry angle, which is going to be a problem. Now, the little controller for the iCue Link system needs to be plugged in the USB connection as well, so just showing that again as a reminder. Make sure that's connected up so that you have that. And also that requires PCIe power as well. So find one of those PCIe power cables that's split like this that would be for a graphics card, because I need one of those 6 pins for this system too. Make sure it's powered properly. If you're using a standard fan power controller, you'd need a SATA cable, which is the flat connectors instead. But obviously I'm using the iCue Link system for this build. But if you're using the standard installation with the PWM controllers, then you'd use the SATA power connectors that are included in the PSU case. So the other thing to do is to plug all your cables in to the power supply unit before you put the PSU in the case, because it'll be a lot easier than fiddling around trying to see afterwards. Then what I did is I basically fed those cables through into the case and positioned them in a way where it'd be nice and easy to access them. Also, you can see me plugging in that CPU power connector that I plugged into the motherboard earlier on. Note the position of the fan here. The fan's facing the outside of the case so it can draw cold air in and then exhaust out of the ports. So this is the way to do it, not the other way around, where you'd obviously be restricting the airflow. So it will be sucking air in from this way. So make sure you do the same thing. And then you can see the rear of it, you've got to screw in to the corners with the included screws, and this is where the hot air would vent out of the system as well. And there's loads of venting on this case too, so that make it easy for you. And then again, 24-pin power cable. You will know that despite the fact that these are short cables, the PSU is basically right next to the motherboard, so there's still a lot of a mess of cables here. Some cable tidying may well help. I'm not going to do it, and that will result in problems for me. But hopefully you won't have issues if you tie some of your cables together or down to the case. There are several different mounting points for doing so if you want to. Don't forget your power connections and USB connections for the iCue Link system controller as well, and the adapter for that. So you can see this thing is coming together nicely, but you can already see there's quite a few different cables to deal with in here and a lot of mess potentially and potential issues for setting up and dealing with it. So now I'm going to mount the 4070. An important point of note here is it's obviously a large card. You can actually go larger, so you can go longer. You can see there's enough for 3-slot GPUs in here, so you can actually fit bigger ones in. And as I mentioned earlier on in the video, if you have a really small GPU, so you use a really small thin one, which is a smaller slot, you can actually fit more fans into the case as well. So you could put fans on the side of the case where the GPU is mounting currently, which means you might have better airflow, which would probably be beneficial on a small case like this. Obviously, those fans aren't included, and you may well want the thin ones if possible, but it is nice to have that option. Unfortunately, I can't do it here, but it is nice to be able to see that the larger GPUs will fit in this relatively small case from Corsair. Downside is this adapter cable is quite big and problematic. It's seemingly not as well thought out as the other cables that come with this PSU, because you can see I'm trying to negotiate here, and I don't want to put too much pressure on where it's plugged into the PSU, because that's been one of the problem areas, and also just to make sure it doesn't get in the way of other things, because let's not forget there's going to be a radiator above all this in a minute as well. Then I'm using Thermal Grizzly's Cryonaut paste on here. Now if you bought the iCue Link system and installed it directly on here, you don't necessarily need to worry about doing this because it's already pre-applied thermal paste. But because I've used this in 2 different systems, I've cleaned the thermal paste off the CPU and off the pump, and I'm using a fresh coat of Cryonaut, which is nice and effective, good quality cooling performance. And now I'm going to seat the pump head down over the top. Now the benefit of this system is that all the cabling is run through the radiator, so there's no cables coming out of the iCue Link pump, which means less mess to deal with. If you're using a traditional all-in-one cooler, you probably have SATA power connection and a USB connection and a AIO pump header / CPU fan power cable coming out of all of this. You'd have to put those into place. But as this is, all we've got to do is screw those 4 thumb screws down over the top and make sure it is secure. Take care to ensure that you do tighten it up well, not over tighten it, but make sure it is well tightened, because if it's slightly loose, this might cause problems with overheating. Indeed, I didn't even put mine in tight enough. I still found it was getting a bit hot, and I had to take the system apart and tighten it up a little bit more, and that made a difference. There's one simple mistake that's really easy to make, and I've done it multiple times, even when knowing it and taking care. So if you do find your CPU's running too hot, it could be that. The cable from the controller needs to plug into the radiator, and then the radiator plugs into the fans. And then the iCue Link system is now daisy chained, so that little controller is controlling these fans, the pump, and the other fans that we installed earlier on. And then just seating that back down on top. Now note here how much trouble I'm having with the GPU power cable, and also bear in mind what you can't see, which is underneath. all the tubes from the pump, all the other power cables, everything else, there is a limited amount of space here, which is why it matters to have the fans on this side of the radiator rather than the other. So setting it up and screwing everything down. But we can see the GPU from here and the power supply unit, and then the cable plugs in to the top, and then we're just going to turn it on and make sure everything's running nicely before we put the case back together. So there's actually a setup, an adapter included in the box for running a PSU cable, because obviously this is out of the top of the case, as you'll see in a second, and we need to make sure it runs down into a more convenient place, which is one of the nice things about the 2000D. So the RGB is working, the fans are spinning, relative success. So now with this adapter, it connects up to the top, and then there are multiple points that you can mount the PSU cable and run it across the top and then down the rear of the case. So these loops are designed for that, to allow you to basically tidy things up. And you can see this allows you to extend the PSU cable into a position where it would normally be if you were plugging your power supply cable in, which would be in the bottom of the case, for example. So it lets you keep things quite neat. So that's nice. And then I'm just going to show you from several angles before we put the thing back together. But this is what it looks like. I'm pretty pleased with how it's come out. Obviously 6 fans, and then the GPU is mounted on the rear. You can see the GPU poking out, and this is the setup. So nice bit of RGB lighting as well. As you can see, the RGB is visible from both. The other benefit of these iCue Link fans, the QX fans, is each of them has its own thermal sensor on it as well. So if you're keen on monitoring the temperatures of your system, very beneficial, because not only readouts for the whole system and individual parts like the CPU and GPU, but you can also get on a fan by fan basis. So that's nuts. And control the fans. Overall, great system. Like I said, I've reviewed and done a wiring guide on it in more depth if you want to find out more about that. But now you can see the setup for that and the finished look of it, and just how much space there is in such a tiny case. So actually a fairly joyful ITX build that went pretty well. There's a few issues, as I said. Just think about the thickness of those front fans and how that might impact the motherboard. Think about the wiring logic and where you're going to put your wires, and plan that sort of stuff out before you install things. And then we've got to put things back together. That magnetic dust tray that goes on the rear, and then other things. So I went to put the doors back on, and this is a small point. I like to make lots of small points about things that you might miss or the mistakes that you might make as well. Because the doors, so the left and right doors, will hook back on and screw back in with ease, thumb screws. But I actually did this the wrong way around, so I actually put them on the wrong way around. And it's possible to do this and not realise until you go to put the lid back on to the top. And interesting small design quirk, which initially doesn't look like a problem because everything clips back in as it should. So the front panel goes back on and the doors have gone back on and everything looks neat, but then you can't put the top on, or at least it won't sit down 100%. So if you do find that you can't get the top on, it's probably because you made the same mistake as me. So with these back on, what I found was that you could put the top back on. You'll see there's a little notch for where the power cable should go, and then it just basically pushes in with some pins and some magnetic feet. But what I found was it just wouldn't sit back in properly. Although some of it clipped down, it wasn't sitting on there completely flush. You can't see it from this angle, but I noticed it and I thought, that's strange. Why is that doing that? And so I wanted to work that out. And then when I flipped the case over to look at the I/O ports, I noticed there was some notches on the doors at the edges. So then I realized that's because those line up with the top. So flip them over. So if you see those notches in the middle and at the front of these side doors, that's for holding the panels on. So where the thumb screws are at the rear and then in the middle of the door, that's how those panels get held on. But then the top panel just lines up with those as well. So that's why small, simple mistakes lead to me telling you things that you hopefully won't have issues with, or highlighting things to stop you having issues. So that's how that connects up and sits in there. But you can see now that's done, the PSU cable is not visible. Where we do have a pain of having to run the I/O to the underside of the case. This is one of the downsides of this case. One thing I didn't like about the design is you need to think about all the different things you're going to plug into it. So I've got an HDMI cable and a USB cable plugged in there, but also any wireless dongles that you want to plug in. And obviously, as I said, the wireless adapter as well. Now we do have the front panel USB still we can use, but you're probably going to be plugging in more things than that. And you might need to tip it over and plug extras in. You can see here I had to tip it over to plug an Ethernet cable in, for example, so I could get the drivers installed so I could use the internet on it. And then there's a cover that goes back over that porthole. It is kind of neat because you're then hiding away the cables, but otherwise not ideal. So hopefully a interesting insight into how to build this case, things to think about and other things. Be sure to subscribe and come back for more if you want to see my review on the performance of the case and also related things on the power supply unit, on the motherboard, and other things that I came across while doing it. Let me know what you think in the comments and subscribe if you've made it this far because I appreciate you listening to me. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.